I hope a lot of you got to see Daniel Libeskind this morning. It was a fantastic, impassioned account of his World Trade Center vision, and very remarkable. And of course, yesterday we heard in the first plenary Larry Silverstein reflecting that it's actually going to take him over 20 years to deliver that project, which kind of struck a chord with me because it's the 20 years that Melbourne has really changed. It's become, in that 20 years, a really vibrant 24/7 city. And that's through the introduction of inner city residential high-rise typology. Melbourne's become a skyscraper city. It always had some tall buildings, but it's really come into its own as a skyscraper city. And we know that skyscrapers bring commerce to cities, but in Melbourne, they've brought population as well. And of course, population is the essential ingredient to make fantastic city places. The introduction of people into the city, which prior to the 90s was very, very rare. Melbourne was a commercial-based city. It's fertilised the place into a city of events, of cultural happenings, of beautiful venues, food, events, etc., etc. It's really become a fantastic place to live and to visit. So today, I'd like to give you a snapshot on how Melbourne has emerged in recent times. And I'd like to, with your indulgence, I'd like to do this with using some of our buildings as exemplars. But remember that for every building that I show you of mine, and I'm not showing you others because I can't talk about them too well, but I can talk about mine forever. But for every one of the buildings that I'm showing you, and they're just a few of the ones we've done in the city, there's many, many more that have been developed recently.
Yes. I didn't think he was going to play it, Mike. He was spot on.
Okay. To the wing position on the member stand side. Oh!
Let's enjoy this mark of Alex Jeselenko's again. It was the mark of the year in 1970 and one of the marks of the 70s.
One of our strange sports. It's so loved by Melburnians. It was invented in Melbourne in 1858. And it was this fascination with height. It's the pinnacle of the game, getting people up as high as they can go. And there's no doubt that Melburnians have always had, like most of the people around the world, a fascination with height. And that fascination has now been translated into our tall buildings in the city. But the real remarkable thing is the recency of all of this. 20 years, the last 20 years. So to put this into perspective, what I'd like to do is just go back to the start of Melbourne and just show you what happened very, very quickly. In 1835, a chap called Batman sailed a little boat into Port Phillip Bay, which is our little harbour, full of some hopeful settlers. Actually, not too many. I don't think it was more than a dozen people or so. And when they landed, Batman traded with the indigenous tribe, the Wurundjeri tribe, who are the traditional owners of the land. And for a few knives, trinkets and whatever, he bought some 1,000 of acres. And that was the start of Melbourne, these people coming there and doing that. And just to put it into perspective, 1835, when that happened, New York was a thriving city, a real metropolis. In fact, it was the year that you had the Great Fire here. And, pardon me, in 1938, just 3 short years later, Hoddle, a surveyor, laid out the plan for Melbourne, a rectangular grid, kind of north-south, but parallel to the river, so just off axis, a 200-metre grid. And that was the basis of the Victorian city that followed, low-rise stone buildings, rather beautiful. But what happened very quickly, based on gold became discovered in the 1850s, and Melbourne transposed into a really viable and rich commercial centre, and it expanded, but very, very low rise. In the 50s, after the war, the migration from Europe to Australia It was very popular in Australia because everybody could have a house and garden. And in the 50s, the population of Melbourne was about $1.5 million. Every couple could buy their little dream house. And guess what? There's my parents. And that's their dream house. They paid £5,000 for it in 1956. A little house on a quarter of an acre, unmade road, no sewerage, no stormwater, and at the end of our street, a barbed wire fence and a forest. So for me, it was wonderful, but it was real pioneering stuff. And we were only 15 kilometres out of the city centre, but we felt like we were out in the bush. Little did we know that we were the pioneers of the urban sprawl, and that very quickly this dream of home ownership would spread like an oil slick across the surface of Melbourne and go to the horizon. It was, everybody commuted to the city, and the city was a 9 till 5:30 commercial centre. 5:30, they would leave the office, they'd go straight to the pub. We had liquor laws. The pub was open for half an hour. They'd have a drink, and they'd get in their car, steel themselves for the drive home back into the suburbs. The city vacated, it was empty. The use of cars, we were a car oriented city. We commuted. Every family had a couple of cars, 2 or 3 cars, and of course the traffic havoc that caused, the pollution that caused, it really was unbearable, and something had to happen, notwithstanding how tough it is sitting in traffic for an hour each way every day. So I think that it started, the idea of living in the city started to take effect. So this is wonderful Melbourne. A few years ago, and the red dot spots Melbourne Terrace. This was our first residential project. It was actually just a 25-metre, 8-storey tall building, so not high-rise at all, but higher density than anyone was really used to, and in the city, remarkable. It was developed by my partner on a car park. It had 90-odd apartments. People today comment to me and say they love the way that we actually renovated this building, which I take as a great compliment because it means it seems like it's always sat there. This site today would probably have a 300-metre tower on it, but in those days this was a pioneering building. We were concerned about the way it came to the ground, the way it interacted with the public realm. Planting on the street, sculpture. It articulated the doorways, personalised the entries into the building, but it also put a dialogue between the public and the private interface. And if you have a little look at Hercules' leg, it's quite polished. It's a bit like the foot of St. Peter. All the brides go there on Saturday for their wedding photos, and they very lovingly stroke the leg. Maybe that's to do with hopeful virility or something, but it's nice that it engages, that art engages in the public realm. It brought, I guess, Manhattan-type loft living to the city. And something had to be good about this, because to leave a house and come into an apartment, that was very, very unknown territory. So these apartments had to really work, become interesting spaces that played with light and were very flexible. And that building was filled not only by me, but by another bunch of friends, actors, the artistic society, and it's had very little turnover. So it was a great success. My partner developed that, Nonda Katsalidis, and because out of that success he got the taste for development, and he bought a site just around the corner on which we built Republic Tower. This was, again, a very small site. It was a disused site in this fairly rundown end of town at the time. And on that, we got it through local authorities, which was difficult, but we had a very clever planning minister who gave it a permit. And it put the 92 stories of Melbourne Terrace vertically. So this really was one of the first, if not the first, high-rise, albeit small, 90-odd apartments in Melbourne. Again, it brought some interesting apartments. Again, it had to compensate for people downsizing and living in beautiful environments. But some of the apartments were grand. They brought fantastic views that people had never really imagined before. And very democratically, we placed a swimming pool up on the top level so everybody could have this beautiful space, views while they were swimming. We inherited on the site a ventilation shaft, which became a canvas for public art. We couldn't build on it. So sometimes out of these difficulties, great opportunities arise. And this every 3 months, the art changed, and it changed with ceremony. And I think this is part of the building of legends, little legends in the city, and buildings interacting with the city. So this every 3 months, the poster changed. It was unveiled. There was a little opening in the cafe downstairs. At a certain time, a couple of motorbike cops would come, close the traffic. We'd go to the centre of the road with our champagne, and we'd celebrate as this thing was unveiled, while the motorists started honking their horns in angst at us. But it became one of the little events of the city. It brought a fine dining restaurant, and it brought a cafe to the street. And the cafe was shielded from north light, where our sun comes from, by timber and planting. And so that again brought softness to a city street. Timber, planting, the sort of things you would expect in suburbia, but which you don't suspect or expect in the city. So moving on, we did a number of buildings in the city. In fact, our office was in the first building, Melbourne Terrace, and we decided amongst ourselves we would only do buildings that we could walk to. And so we're very interested in residential in the city. And these I'm going to show you 2 projects quickly, which were renovations of buildings, a very, very sustainable reimagining of buildings. This was Spring Street. It was a tawdry old office building which we renovated into 2 apartments a floor, refacaded it, put bay windows so people could look up and down the street, and they became very, very popular apartments. And this particular building, the Blonde Brick Building, was a postal hall, the first tall building built in Melbourne after the war, built very sturdily by a government architect, so sturdily that we could put 6 levels of residential on top, which we did in quite lightweight construction. The plan form really suited apartments, and again, it was a heroic thing to do to an elderly building, and hence we named it Hero. The Docklands. The Docklands is an area in Melbourne that was neglected for many, many years. It was the site of the docks, but with containerisation, it didn't work for the huge ships and the craneage that was required. So the land, the main dock had to shift, and the land became dormant. The government, in its wisdom, parcellised the land, put it out to tenderers, and we were successful with a development company that developed on this north side of the Docklands. And to this we brought about 1,500 apartments in those days. It was very, very successful. I remember having to present this to authorities and really biting my tongue as I said, this will become a 24/7 part of Melbourne. But it was really very, very derelict and hard to imagine. But what it did, which was, I think, of great importance, it actually brought water to the city. The city extended into a water zone. And whilst we're on a bay, all of the bay is fringed by housing that's separate, just single houses separated from the ocean by a road. This brought people right onto the waterfront, and it brought beautiful uses, retail, galleries, it brought moorings, and so it was a very nice new component to Melbourne. It helped enrich Melbourne. Eureka Tower was completed in 2006, but around 2000 is when we designed it and marketed it. Now this was a very, very courageous step by the developers. Again, it was my partner Nonda. He's got cast iron you-know-whats as far as development goes, because not only was it tall, 300 metres, it brought 590 apartments in one development. Now that was about 3 or 4 times what's normally released in the marketplace, so it was a very, very brave move. But it was also on the South Bank, which traditionally was a light industrial area. We had a planning minister who had a lot of vision, and he actually reimagined the whole south side of the river as a beautiful precinct, and it was his work that started this precinct going. And you can see the way it developed. My partner Nonda with a syndicate, bought the site. It had a planning permit for 2 buildings. We analysed them in the wind tunnel, they were a disaster. We analysed them for shadow, they were a disaster. They added to the wall of the buildings on that side of the river, that was a disaster. So there was a simple solution to that, a brave solution, but just put one on top of the other, add a little bit more, and you have Eureka Tower, 300 metres tall. And so Eureka Tower really encouraged more development on the south side of the river. And the city really leapt the river. I think in this particular photograph here, you can see now that the river, which was a frontier of the city, is now embraced in the city fabric. So between Docklands, which is to the left of the slide, South Bank, the city has become a much more beautiful and integrated place to live. The city is now embraced, although it's separated from the north side by railways, which the various governments have had attempts to bridge and get the city coming down to the river. And maybe one day, with a courageous government, that will happen and the city really, really will embrace the river. We put an observation deck on the top of the building. Again, quite a courageous thing to do, because normally you would put a multi-million-dollar penthouse or two at the top, but this was public space. We were really interested in allowing the public, allowing visitors to come to the top of Eureka Tower and make it a public place, and it's become an incredibly popular tourist event. So Eureka has engaged, added and enriched the city, we think. I've lived in a few of our apartments, and I live in an apartment in Eureka, which is a quarter of a kilometre up from the ground, which is also where I work, in the podium. So I commute a quarter of a kilometre every day in an elevator, and every morning I wake up, it's a different kind of view. It's just absolutely stunning. I couldn't imagine living anywhere else. And this is just one morning waking up and seeing the rest of Melbourne under clouds. It's good fun living on top of helicopters too. And talking about the legend of the city, the gold glass on the top, which actually was symbolic of the gold rush days. We had a Eureka Stockade, it was called, where the miners rebelled against the constabulary who were treating them fairly hard. So the gold was emblematic of that, and the building was called Eureka. But sometimes with moist colloidal particles in the air, they reflect light in dramatic ways. And it engages people. So here's a kid, he sent me an email and he says something like, I was walking along St Kilda Road and I saw people looking up and I saw this incredible effect and I photographed it and I've sent you this photograph, and I'm not sure if it was intended, but this was on the Friday the 15th of June around midday. And a number of people have done that. And of course, if they take the trouble to do that, you take the trouble to answer. So I replied, of course, yes. Thank you for noticing that, because this building was intended to reflect light beautifully on the 15th of June every year around midday. And it does do crazy things. And so all of a sudden, cities which are bleak, grey, all of a sudden they have a shining night. And since we've done this, there's quite a few buildings that have followed suit and been brave enough to use some strongly coloured glasses and help to give the city vibrance. Over the road, actually, Australia 108. This building is just about to be built. It's actually taller than Eureka. Now, you do a building like Eureka, you don't really think that you'll be doing another one over the road that's taller. In fact, when we got the planning permit for it, nobody quite realised that we were up in the aeroplane zone. Not even the planners knew. They hadn't noticed. It was an old law, but we were so high we were in uncharted areas. They found out quick enough when the Aviation Authority got onto it, and we had to, after we got the permit, we had to lower the building. It was quite embarrassing for the government. But again, this was developed by my partner, but the development group lost the appetite to develop and sold it to a very wonderful Singaporean client who saw the photograph that I took from my apartment and then used it for his marketing campaign. The highest residences live above the clouds, and he was fantastic. As we went through the design development of this building, it only got better, rather than being value engineered down. It's 317 metres tall. It has 1,106 apartments, just under 600 cars. It has 3 rises, low, mid and high rise, and the high rise and mid rise are separated by what we call the gold starburst, which is loosely the shape of the Commonwealth star on our flag, and includes all the facilities, a couple of swimming pools, lounges, kitchens, dining rooms, so people that even live in small apartments can take larger groups up and utilise these fantastic facilities and have their friends who might not fit in their apartment enjoy the view. A couple of facts, because I can't resist doing this. This occupies 0.6 of a hectare, and so, 0.6 of an acre. And so if we're talking about sustainability, if you were to house these 1,105 apartments out in the suburbs, it would take 300 acres of land. You would be probably an hour's drive away. Every house would have 3 cars, because that's what you do when the parents each have one and the kid has one. There are cars parked on lawns. All of that would be pollution creating stuff. It's a very, very sustainable and great way to live. The building weighs, does anyone want to venture a guess? No engineers. 150,000 tonnes, and to put that into perspective, that's 3 times the Titanic. 13,000 curtain wall panels, 50,000 square metres of curtain wall, 6,000 doors and 250 piles. It's quite a piece of work. It actually is quite orthogonal at the base and has shoulders like Eureka, which relate to the neighbours in terms of scale and height. And as the building extrudes up, it becomes a little more curvaceous into the sky. It sits just over the road. This is almost like taking the photograph from Eureka Tower, and it has a relationship with Eureka Tower. They have similar glass. This is the sky deck, which has actually become gold, so the 2 golds talk to each other. They're very much a pair of towers, and put swimming pools up in the sky, infinity pools. They're almost mandatory now, up in the sky. And as we trail down the building, you might just see that the car parking is held behind vertical gardens. So quite a tough city street actually has now vertical gardens. And the 2 buildings working together form like goalposts each side of a main road that takes you up to the surf coast regions of Melbourne and Victoria. Connected to the art precinct, and all of a sudden the city has leapt the river and the city has changed thanks to the dynamic and power of these buildings. Another couple of towers that we're doing back up towards Republic Tower and Melbourne Terrace. These towers are 2 glass, quite sculptural towers, and they bring 1,500 people to one place, and you can see the illuminated towers here right next door to the Heritage Market, bringing population to this area which was quite downtrodden, but a lot of work on the podium, making the podium compelling, interesting, engaging, unusual materials, again materials that you would associate with residential housing, and creating more of Melbourne's laneways, places for people to meet and greet, discovery, and bringing a lot of facility into the city. So rather than towers just crashing down, bringing wind to the ground, making beautiful people places. And so Melbourne's become, for the last 5 years, by The Economist, the most livable city in the world. I think that that's happened because these towers have been urban catalysts. They've brought public, they've brought interest, complexity and scale. But I suppose we should ask ourselves, did Hoddle's little Victorian grid serve us well? Yes, because the ground plane, it's a scale that works for people, and these towers come from the ground plane, and a lot of the heritage buildings and facades were retained, so it's a very rich mix. Has the city grown too fast? No. It was needed. People say, well, this place is going to become like Hong Kong. So fast, so much. But hey, Hong Kong's a great place too. We needed it. Has the city improved? Yes. The population, it's come into the city, and it's a very, very vibrant place to be. Has the city developed bad examples of high-rise? Bet your sweet ass it has. But so what? You know, not all of us are beautiful. And if a city's... If a city is a great place, it can absorb pieces of, you know, not quite so great architecture. And the ground plane preserves the public realm. Do the city planners need to articulate a vision for the city to facilitate and stimulate appropriate development? Definitely yes. This caught them by surprise. They've had knee-jerk reactions. Our minister a few weeks ago brought in some plot ratio rules which were not thought out. I don't mind rules. At least you know what you can put on a site. But these were brought out under the table so quickly without collaboration that it's left a number of very, very good schemes high and dry to be replaced by lesser schemes because of the setbacks that come with the plot ratio, which are mandatory. And finally, have skyscrapers added dimension, character, global presence, sustainability and successful commerce to Melbourne? Oh yeah, it's a hell of a place where people love to come, love to live, love to invest. So I'm just going to finish very quickly with one project that I've really, really enjoyed working on, which is actually in Malaysia. And I show this perhaps a little prematurely, but I show it because, again, this is a council of tall buildings, and how do tall buildings enrich the city environments? And I think this is a really, really interesting case, which no doubt we'll learn more about in the future. It's in KL, and KL, as probably a lot of you know, is really well known for the Petronas Towers and the KL Tower. But also there's a wonderful little district called Bukit Bintang, and this makes up what's fondly called the Golden Triangle. And this is a kind of centre of the KL universe. This is the catalyst approach of these three pieces have made it a very rich and wonderful urban centre. But we're looking at a building that's beyond it. And it's a building that brings a lot of mixed use to KL. It's a tall tower, a very tall tower. But because of the population that will work there and live there, and because of the retail opportunities, and because it's on a heritage site, it's needed extension of the MRT, a station at the site, a tunnel to bring to control traffic, traffic improvements on the surface, and it's inspiring improvement in the area, which is a little bit run down. And so I think it would be reasonable to expect that the centre of gravity of KL will enlarge and become again fertilised by this particular development and the development that it encourages around it. It occurs on the heritage site of Stadium Merdeka, which is where in 1957 the Malaysians declared independence. It's a very, very important site. It also has the Stadium Negara, the round site at the bottom. And the development, of course, is the development in the blue, and the larger triangle in the middle is the tower, which has a few smaller towers which bring residential to mainly an office building with a hotel and other mixed uses with a large retail. But whilst it looks quite contained, it's actually very open. It's about people being able to move through this development to get to the stadium from public transport, to have lots of opportunities and discovery on the way. There's a beautiful garden that's being proposed, which on the one hand is a water garden, but when the stadium is being used, will dry up. It'll be a dry creek bed, which allows it to become a breakout space for the stadium on performance days. And so it does not try to emulate the beautiful Petronas Towers, which in a way have a great local connection due to their plan forms. This is quite a building of the future. It articulates the structural pathways, and they become shapes that are a bit subtly to do with Malaysian patterns. And I think that we're very excited about this, and if all goes smoothly, I think it'll be a great addition to the character and the complexity and the opportunity of KL. And with that, I thank you all very much.